For us cast netters, we have two types of nets to choose from, depending on the application. The first of these is the Spanish net, this one here. But most of us call it a bag or a pocket net because it's more descriptive, and it's a shallow water net and used while wading. Here's how it works. Once the net settles on the bottom, the thrower reaches down into the pocket or the bag to retrieve the mullet and puts them in a sack slung over his shoulder. Braille lines aren't required for this type of net, so neither is a horn, and many choose not to use a hand line to reduce bulk. These nets start at 3/4 of a pound per radius foot, which is ideal for shallow water use, and this reduced weight also makes it easier on the back and arms, especially after loading one of the larger nets, say 6 or 8 times in a rising tide. And these sizes range in 7 feet to 11-foot radius. The bag net is very popular along the Florida Panhandle and other areas with expansive beaches. Our second choice is the Braille, or the long line net. Now, as opposed to the Spanish net, this net is used in deep water. So it's the most popular, but it can also be used for wading if you don't do a lot of it. Skirt design of this net has pretty much disappeared, so most of these nets are 6 or 8 panels. And they range in length from 6 to 14 feet, like so. And these nets are used mostly off a boat or a pier, boat, pier, dock, bridge, etc. And these of course come with a hand line that varies in length from 20 feet to 30 feet depending on where you're throwing from. And both nets are limited to a legal radius of not greater than 14 feet and not more than 2 nets per boat, assuming you're non-commercial. Most off-the-shelf nets have weights of 1 pound and 1.5 pound per radius foot, with the exception of the bag net that starts at 3/4 of a pound, this one here. Lead is the most common material, but I know a few fishermen that make their own nets wouldn't even think of using a net unless it was weighted with galvanized or stainless steel chain. As far as I know, only custom net makers produce chain-weighted nets, on request only. But to my mind, there isn't any benefit to justify the extra cost. High-quality nets can be found in specialty stores and, of course, custom net makers. I won't endorse any net makers because I make my own nets, and won't name any stores because my intention was to make these videos commercial-free. However, I do have some recommendations. And the first is, always try the net. Try a friend's if you can. A good off-the-shelf 10-footer can run you $100 and a custom-made net up to $200. Don't make yourself like a net just because you paid a bundle for it. The second thing is, make it perfectly clear and upfront, preferably in writing, especially if you're buying off the internet, that you both agree you'll try the net, and if you don't like it, you're going to get a full refund upon its return. So you want a full refund if you don't like it. Now, if you can't get both 1 and 2, I'd keep looking and freely express your concerns to the supplier, because a good one will understand what you're trying to do, and they'll work with you on this. Number 3 is you want a clear mono net. Let throwers that like an audience splurge on nets dyed pink and green and blue and camo and every other color under the sun. Personally, I haven't found them to serve any purpose at all. But if you just have to have it, you can go to Wally World and buy a box of RIT dye for a couple of bucks. RIT, that's a kind of a powder form. What you want to do here is you want to stick with pure lead. Stay away from hybrids, and by all means, don't touch any net with weights covered in plastic. A lot of suppliers these days are trying to dump their inventory, so ask what they're using for weight. But most important, I think, you need to follow your instincts. Remember, caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. Protect yourself. Let's take a look at why some of us choose to use larger and or heavier nets. A heavier net, by my definition, is any net that weighs more than 10 pounds. So that would be heavier net is 10 pounds, greater than or equal to 10 pounds. For example, a 7-foot net at 1.5 pounds would weigh 10.5, and a 10-foot net at 1 pound would weigh 10 pounds. So both of these would be at the low end of the heavier net category, or using a boxing analogy, they'd be light heavyweights, if you will. So let's make a subcategory here called the light heavyweights to clarify this example. So we have the 7-foot net at 1.5 pounds per foot. That net would weigh 10.5 pounds. Then we have the 10-foot net at 1 foot, or 1 pound per foot, and that would equal 10 pounds. So what I'm saying is both of these nets are in the same category regardless of their radius, because they meet the requirement of being equal to or greater than 10 pounds. A well-made net in a 1.5 pound per radius foot would be chosen for 3 reasons. Okay, and the first one is if it's well made, the net would be used in deeper water. The second reason, assuming it's still a well-made net out of the proper size mono, say in 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch square category, and where you would want to increase the sink rate, you would use this heavier net. So you want to increase the sink rate. Okay, that's assuming now it's a well-made net. And the third one is it's a poorly made net, but it's made out of mono that's much larger in diameter than necessary, and therefore reducing the sink rate. So what the supplier does, he compensates for this by adding more weight, putting the burden on you to throw a heavier net than necessary. Okay, so this is in a poorly made net. You'll find these in foreign-made nets, and my recommendation is to avoid them like the plague. They're generally found in chain stores and guys dumping them on Craigslist. Okay, then there's the heavyweight category. And let's say you have a 12-foot net at 1 pound per foot. That equals 12 pounds. This is a very popular net. And if you're throwing off a bridge and you can only get, say, 2 to 4 throws, when the fish are coming through and going deep, you would probably choose this net. I happen to use this net off of a boat. Then there's a third category, and that's the 14-foot nets. Okay, and these come in 1 pound and 1.5 pound. So the weight range would be 14 to 21 pounds. These nets are pretty much reserved for I call a throw for show guys. These are the guys that like an audience. I've seen more of these nets sitting in garage corners or trying to get dumped on Craigslist than I've ever seen on the flats by the very best of throwers. Now let me get more specific and analytical now on why a 10-foot net would be chosen over an 8-footer, for example. You remember this formula from your days of learning. The area of a circle is equal to pi r squared. So that's equal to constant pi, which is 3.14 times the radius times the radius. So we have this because this guy right here, called an exponent, is telling us that this variable here needs to be multiplied by itself twice. If this were a 3, this would be radius times radius times radius, and so on. So let's plug in the numbers for an 8-foot net and see what we get for a full open on this net in terms of square feet. So we would have pi 3.14 times 8 times 8. And that would give us 64 times 3.14, and that would be, let's see, the calculator is saying 201 square feet. So we'll plug in the same thing for a 10-footer, and that would be 10 times 10, and that's 100, so times that, we move this over a couple spots, so this is 314 square feet. So you could see by examination here that this is, a tad over 50% bigger. But if you want it to be more precise, you could do this simple calculation. 314 minus 201 divided by 201. That would give you, when you calculate, that would give you a decimal, but we want it in percentage, so we have to multiply it by 100, and that gives us 56%. Therefore, the percent increase from an 8-footer to a 10-footer is such a big jump because the area is directly proportional to the square of the radius. In other words, for a small increase in the radius, you get a much larger increase in the area, making this move up very cost effective. Try this. Let's say you're approached by a friend looking for advice on whether he should move up to an 8-footer from a 6-footer. So he owns one of these and he wants to go to an 8, and he's asking you to give him some guidance. Plug in the numbers for each to determine their area, and then go to a supplier, a typical supplier, and compare the prices. Your friend will be pleasantly surprised with the numbers you provide him.